Good afternoon, everyone. A lovely autumnal afternoon. And I'm very happy to welcome Brian Kimberling in the middle, Alison Moore closest to me, to Small Wonder, as well as Freya McClements, who's chairing this afternoon's session. You may already have been introduced to Brian Kimberling via his nano story on the back of the Small Wonder Festival brochure. If you haven't already seen that, I'm sure there are brochures lying around outside that you should pick up and have a look at and take home with you for inspiration. It's a perfect little nano story written to commission specifically for the Small Wonder brochure. Brian Kimberling grew up in southern Indiana and spent 2 years as a research assistant on a major songbird study before living in the Czech Republic, Turkey, Mexico, and now the UK. I'm not sure how long he'll be with us in the UK, so we're very thrilled to catch him while he's still staying put for a little while. His debut collection of short stories, Snapper, is a poignant and hilarious coming-of-age cycle that stems from his experience as a birdwatcher. Alison Moore was born in Manchester. Her award-winning stories have been published in various magazines, and her new collection is called The Pre-War House and Other Stories. Her debut novel, The Lighthouse, was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize last year and has just won the Society of Authors McKetterick Prize for her first novel. Freya McClements, who's come here all the way from Derry to chair this event this evening, is a BBC producer and literary reviewer for the Irish Times. Her debut volume of short stories is called The Dangerous Edge of Things. The Dangerous Edge of Things. She's this year's winner of the Darker Times short story competition. So I'm going to welcome everyone on the platform and hand over to Freya McClements.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to start with a couple of readings. Alison's going to kick us off, and then Brian, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion ourselves, and then open the floor to a Q&A. So, Alison.
Okay. The story I'm going to read is a story I was invited to submit to the Screaming Book of Horror, which was published by Screaming Dreams Press. So it gives you some idea of its genre. It's called Sometimes You Think You Are Alone. As soon as you wake up, you want to run. Your body craves the endorphins, the endogenous morphine. They experimented on mice, making them want to run and then taking their treadmill away. When they looked at what this did to the mice, to their brains, they found that the mice were suffering from the same symptoms as an addict withdrawing from drugs. You leave your house at dawn. You run while the street lamps are still lit, and the odd car which goes by has its headlights on. You run in the same top you slept in, with something fluorescent over it to keep you safe. Most of the houses past which you run are still in darkness. The occasional light goes on behind a still-drawn curtain or blind. The milkman might have begun his rounds, but as soon as you can, you turn off the road and get onto the dirt track. It is possible that no one at all will see you go by. You run the same route every day, in all weathers. You know how it feels to run when the ground is hard, dry and dusty, or frozen over. You know how it feels to run in the rain when the dirt track is slippery and the potholes have become puddles, and you return home mud-spattered and sodden. You must know every inch of it by now. You could probably run the course blindfolded. On either side of the dirt track, there are fields. Sometimes there are cows which watch you go by, and sometimes they don't bother looking up. Sometimes there are sheep, and sometimes there's just fleece caught on the barbed wire fence. While you run, you listen to music, always the same C60 tape, a compilation your boyfriend made for you before he left you. The first side of the tape takes you as far as the woods. You can see the woods from the back of your house, the dark shape of them in the distance. In the evening, you sometimes come to your bedroom window to watch the sun go down behind the trees. As you enter the woods, you turn the tape over and listen to the B-side. By this time, you're high on the endorphins, opioids preventing pain signals from reaching your brain. It is the endorphins which keep you running when you would think that you no longer could. You pass the warden's lodge and the rhododendron bushes in which children make dens. You skirt one end of the old quarry, nearing the bird hides, and taking the path which leads you back onto the dirt track where your tape runs out again. At the end of the track, the point at which you turned off the road, you stop, exhausted, breathing hard. You must stretch your muscles so as to avoid pain later. You have come to expect to see a man who walks his dog there before breakfast. At first, the two of you were just on nodding terms, but then you began to remove your earphones and say hello to him. You found that both the man and his dog were friendly. Now the man asks after your mother while you pet his dog. By the time you are back on the road, walking home, it is light, and people are up and about. You see them coming out onto their doorsteps in their dressing gowns, fetching in milk, or already dressed for work, going to their cars. You don't know their names, and they don't know yours. They are your neighbours, but you have never spoken to any of them. When you get inside your house, you go for a shower. You stand under the shower for a long time. You use products which you think are animal friendly. You don't spend long in front of the mirror or getting dressed. You wear the same outfit for days, thinking no one notices. You skip breakfast, even though you must be hungry. You must feel hungry most of the time. You don't even have coffee. You go to work on the bus because you can't drive. You work in an office in town, in an ugly building. I forget what you do there. It is nothing important. At lunchtime, you sit in the park and feed your sandwiches to the pigeons. You read a book. You always have a book in your bag. You read while you're waiting at the bus stop and on the bus so that no one will talk to you. You're never alone with a book, you say, but you are. In the evenings, you tend to stay in. You watch a lot of television. You like talent shows. You have an insatiable appetite for show tunes. You used to sing, but your father discouraged you. Now your father is dead, and you have toyed with the idea of entering one of these contests, but you never have. You eat a bowl of cereal in front of the television. You like the sugary sort they make for children, with cartoon characters on the packet. You eat a lot of cereal and cheese. You will try different sorts of cheese, but you prefer cheddar. You ought to eat more fruit and red meat. You go to bed early so that you can get up as soon as it is light and go running in the woods. Sometimes it takes you a while to get to sleep, though, and sometimes you wake with a start in the middle of the night. You have bad dreams. When you open your eyes, it will be dark. You will try to move your head, but it will hurt. You don't go out much. You rarely drink because you don't want a hangover and you don't care for the taste of alcohol anyway. But because you don't drink often, when you do, it really hurts. On your rare evenings out, with people you think of as your friends, you go to bars where you're given telephone numbers which you won't call. It is a long time since your boyfriend left, but you have been slow to move on. He wasn't right for you, but you have trouble seeing it. You always read the Lonely Hearts ads in the local paper. You read them all, the women seeking men and women, the men seeking women and men, but you've never answered one. But last night you went out and you weren't with a friend. For the first time in years, you were out on a date. You went to a restaurant you've never been to before. You arrived 5 minutes early and found a bottle of wine already open on the table, waiting for you. It's been breathing, I said, filling your glass. I've never tried rosé, you said, reading the label before taking a sip. You said something complimentary, something banal. You straightened your cutlery and every little thing on the table. You said, I never go on dates. I noticed that you had plucked your eyebrows. You dressed smartly, but your outfit was one you wear for work. It was nothing special, and I was disappointed in you. While we are talking, you kept looking elsewhere, at the staff and at the other customers and at the door. I found it rude. You weren't always paying attention to what I was saying. It seemed to me that you did not like the wine, but you said that you did, and you accepted another glass. When you drink, you don't get up as soon as it is light and go running, and then you regret it. When you open your eyes and find that you can barely move, you will have to remember what has happened. Sometimes, when you wake with a start before it is light, you wonder if you heard something. You think that maybe something you heard woke you up. You listen, considering the possibility that there is someone else in the house. You don't get up to look, though. You don't even turn on the light. Sometimes you hear nothing and go back to sleep. Sometimes you hear the garden gate banging, and you think, it was only the gate. You don't care that your gate is wide open. You keep your front door locked, but you don't always secure your back door. You go to bed leaving windows ajar. You are lazy like that. Or, sitting up in bed, listening to the night, you hear a dog barking. It was just a dog, you think, and you turn over, pulling your double duvet up over your shoulder and closing your eyes again. It's all that cheese, you think, and you go back to sleep. It must be all the cheese, you said, cutting a wedge of cheddar to put on a digestive biscuit. I eat way too much cheese. You were laughing about how much you like cheese, laughing at yourself telling me that you eat too much cheese, even as you were cutting yourself some more. But it wasn't really funny. You laugh a lot, but you're not a funny person. You have an irritating, nervous laugh. You declined coffee, telling me that you avoid caffeine because it is basically a drug, and then you picked up your wine glass, so that was quite funny. When you open your eyes, you might feel sick. You will probably be thirsty. You will be cold. This is normal. As I helped you into your coat, you talked about your father, who never liked your boyfriend, or you're having a boyfriend at all. Now this boyfriend has left you, and your father is dead anyway. Sometimes you think you are alone, but you are not. You told me how you felt numb when your father died, and I understand. People experience pain in different ways. Some feel pain right away, while for others it comes later, after the initial shock. When you open your eyes and remember what has happened, you will wish that you had not been out drinking. You will want it to be dawn and to be running in the woods. I only had one glass of rosé, which I'd poured for myself before you arrived. I don't drink much alcohol. I like to drive. You heard me joking with someone as I was getting you into the car. You tried to say something, but your tongue wouldn't work. We were as close to your house as mine, but I took us to mine. You were asleep even before we'd set off. I'm a careful driver, but your head kept banging against the side window, and the marks on the side of your neck are from where the strap was cutting into you. You wet yourself, but you were sitting on a waterproof sheet, which I'd put on the passenger seat just in case. You stirred when we arrived, while I was getting you out. You tried again to talk. You seemed concerned about having lost one of your shoes. When we got inside, you reacted to the smell. It's dog meat, I said. I carried you into the living room and put you in a plastic-covered armchair. Your mobile rang in your pocket, and you seemed to be trying to lift your hand to take it out, to see who was calling you, but you couldn't. I've turned your mobile off now. You won't be asleep for much longer, but I don't want the phone to be what wakes you. When you open your eyes, it will be dark. You will wonder where you are. You might hear the dog barking and recognize the sound. You will hear my voice, or at least the sound of my breathing, or the smallest of movements. You will know that you are not alone.
Thank you, Alison. And now, Brian.
Testing. This is called Nationwide. The gypsy moth wasn't what you'd call roadworthy, but I kept her a wheel for a while. The radiator had 2 big cracks, and I discovered these in the middle of nowhere, so I plugged them with bread from my sandwich. 10 miles later, I had toast. After that, I kept an 8-gallon plastic canister in the passenger seat and refilled it every time I passed a lake. When necessary, I pulled over and poured lake water into the radiator along with a few tadpoles. I thought she could use the protein. I found other leaks of other fluids all over the underside of the truck, and I patched these up with duct tape or chewing gum, depending what I had on hand. At that time, I was crisscrossing Indiana counting birds for the Department of Natural Resources, and I generally had to make my repairs deep in the forest somewhere. You can use water for brake fluid, too, I promise. The other problem with the gypsy moth was her appearance. Lola had persuaded me one sunny Sunday that we should spray paint butterflies and fairies and mushrooms on the hood, roof, and sides. Across the top, on both sides of the flatbed cover, she had written gypsy moth in gold glitter. This kind of thing was okay in university towns like Lafayette and Bloomington. But out in real Indiana, I might as well go around in a skirt. Also okay in Lafayette and Bloomington, by the way. I let her do it because I had my own remodeling plans. While she was painting, I put a wooden pallet on the back and a mattress on top of that. I was sure that in her new creation, she'd enjoy going out to watch birds with me. Then she met a potter with 4 motorcycles, but that is a different story. One afternoon, I was driving east away from Lincoln State Park and toward the town of Santa Claus. They wanted to call it Santa Fe, but the post office told them some other town had got there first. Bourbon whiskey may have played a role in the resulting town meeting, but this was 1825, and nobody knows for sure. Anyway, it was over 90 in the shade, which made the gypsy moth even thirstier than usual. She started knocking at me like an old washing machine about to scamper across the kitchen floor. I pulled up at a truck stop, the old-fashioned kind with a chrome-trimmed diner, open 24 hours, where they put the same stuff in your coffee mug they put in your gas tank. As it was so hot, I parked in the shade of a 30-foot concrete statue of St. Nick by the side of the highway, across the forecourt from the diner. I popped the hood and hopped out with my lake water in hand. I got the radiator cap unscrewed and started to pour with an eye out for twigs or minnows, and then I heard flip-flops flapping on the asphalt. I stopped pouring. A plump woman in her 50s with bland hair and bland eyes was looking to speak to me. "You got a leak?" she said. I said that I did. "Hold on right there," she said. "I'll get you some eggs." I thought she must be making a joke about the weather. You could fry an egg on the engine block, that sort of thing. She didn't smile, though, just turned around and flip-flopped back to the diner. I could see there were no customers inside, and I guess she sat in there with the air conditioning on high, just waiting for people like me. There was nothing around but cornfields for several miles. The Michelin Guide to Indiana by Nathan Lockmuller is real short. Everything's flat, everyone's fat, and you can't buy beer on Sunday. That is all you need to know, but I admit that sometimes you do run across a colossal Santa Claus on the highway. "Put these in," she said. She held a carton of 6 white medium chicken eggs out in my direction. 2 or 3 to start." "In where?" I said. "Your radiator. Seal the leak. Sometimes you can just use paprika, but a real leak needs eggs." That bread had held up for 10 miles the first time, so I was inclined to try her eggs out. I thought that for future reference, I should find out which forest songbirds laid the best eggs for automotive repair. "Do I crack it first?" I picked the nearest egg out. "It'll crack itself, but you could give it a hand," she said. "You probably don't want the shell in there, though I don't suppose it would hurt." Lola can crack an egg perfectly on first try every time. It's a skill I've always admired. I wound up with half on the radiator and the other half over my hand. "Try again," she said. I selected another and managed to drop its contents into the radiator. I wasn't sure what to do with the shells. I could see she kept the premises very clean. What else would she do out there? And dropping the shells might seem like littering. "Another one," she said. "I never heard of this," I said. She shrugged as if she expected as much. "It's easy to see the egg will solidify as it boils, but how anyone figured out it will fill up a crack in the process is beyond me." We'd gotten 4 eggs in there when a thin man in a greasy apron joined us outside. "You don't look like a gypsy," he said. He had a sharp, stubbled chin and a permanent squint. I didn't know what he meant. "It says gypsy moth," said the woman. "You can throw them shells in the grass." "I know what it says," the man replied. "You ain't finished it, though, right? You're going for gypsy mother... Ernie!" the woman interjected. "Like truckers, Maud," he insisted. "Everett's rig all done up with Ivan the Terrible, and Kevin says Big Bishop." He was giving me the benefit of the doubt. "You don't look like a gypsy, though," he repeated. Maud had begun inspecting the rest of the truck. "You know, screws is cheaper than duct tape," she said. "Muffler on this model is attached to a plate. It's supposed to be, anyway." I had the whole thing taped to the back bumper. I didn't have any screws, I said. I had assumed the whole thing needed a professional mechanic with heavy equipment. We probably got some that'll fit, she said. Ernie continued his efforts to be friendly. I like this girl with the boobs, he said, pointing at a mermaid on the side. Lola painted that, not me. Maud was on her knees looking underneath the truck. Her voice was remote, muffled. You got a Band-Aid over your gas line, she said. Couple of them. I was getting embarrassed. It leaked, and I was miles from anything, I said. She stood up and shrugged. Just don't drive over an open flame. Tell you what, said Ernie. I'm glad to see a truck like this doing what she was built for. Lola's artwork lay under all kinds of grime and mud and forest grit, and the body was peppered with small dents from rogue gravel on country roads. That truck had even seen a tornado up close. Mostly these days they get waxed every Sunday so they can run to the mall twice a week. What line of work are you in? This was always a tricky question. I'm a bird watcher was the sort of answer they might expect from a man who drove a truck called Gypsy Moth. It suggested that back home in Bloomington or Lafayette I went around in a skirt. I should have made Lola name it Gypsy Queen or something. I'm a researcher, I said. Uh-huh, said Ernie. What do you research? Birds. That's real nice, he said. I wish I had a job like that. Let me ask you a personal question, said Maud. Birdwatchers pay not enough to get your truck fixed? No, I said, not really. Ernie can patch you up, she said. Better than you are now, anyhow. I patch anything up, said Ernie, unless it's electronic. Don't hold with that kind of thing. This here is an honest truck. If you don't want to wait in the heat, come inside, said Maud. Ernie handed his apron to her, and I handed the keys to him. The diner was cavernous and cool, and it was the kind of place I thought extinct outside of Hollywood film sets. There was chrome wainscoting, if that is even the word, all around, punctuated by booths upholstered in dark green faux vinyl, and there were stainless steel napkin dispensers and sugar dispensers and glass ashtrays on every table. Most of the wall space on three sides was given to windows, so you could sit looking at the endless expanse of nothing on the other side. Where there was any wall, it was devoted to big framed pictures and illustrations of Cadillacs and Chevrolets from the 50s and 60s, jolly cars with jaunty tail fins. Get you a coffee, said Maud, and I accepted. I sat in the booth nearest the door where I could watch Ernie working in the improbable shade of Father Christmas. I could also see across the room to an enclosed area with pool tables and pinball machines and an immense silent jukebox. There were pictures of cars in there too, but they were modern sports cars with blondes in bikinis draped over the hood. I surmised that Ernie ran the game room and Maud the restaurant. I had some work to do that I had brought in with me. Finding nests and counting eggs was only half the job. Crunching numbers like nest heights and terrain slope was the other half. My topographical maps were slathered in square root calculations. When I started, I could always get Gerald to correct my errors, but working freelance, I had to be careful. I spread one of these maps over the table to assess my finds that morning. I'd get lost with a map like that, said Maud, delivering coffee. She had a big canvas bag marked U.S. Postal Service over her shoulder. I'd wander around looking for the number 2. Thanks for the coffee, I said. Sometimes I get lost too, I added, to be polite. What kind of birds do you watch, she said. All of them. I try to see how they interact. Some get along fine and some don't. I noticed that, she said. I seen crows and blue jays give a hawk a hard time. At that time, I was most interested in brown-headed cowbirds, but Maud had a point. Same principle, I said. Different birds. Mind if I join you, she said. Every other table was free, but I guess she didn't get much conversation out there. Sure, I said. I'm Nathan. Maud, she said. She had a sizable middle, and settling into the booth with that canvas bag took a while. Don't let me trouble you, though, she said. I got some work of my own. She extracted a clutch of envelopes from the bag along with a pen and some stationery. I returned to my map. I had been calculating slope between 2 nests, but I had fluffed the cosine. I realized that I had left my pocket calculator in the Gypsy Moth. Ernie was halfway underneath it already, inspecting the gas pipe. Across the table, Maud began writing something. The envelope she had opened lay facing me. It was addressed to Santa Claus, Indiana, 47579. The other unopened envelopes I could see bore the same address. Maud noticed my curiosity. She might have been waiting for it. We're the only postally recognized Santa Claus in the world, she said. Come December, I'll have 5 or 6 of these bags. We send a handwritten reply to each one. Just the 2 of you? No, she said. The whole town chips in. There are a couple of There are a couple of houses and a convenience store where Santa Claus is marked on the map 1.5 miles east of Maud's truck stop. In other words, it was just the two of them. Been running since 1912 or 1914, depending who you ask. I suppose most letters to Santa wind up in the dead letter office, but these were smart kids, dedicated kids. They looked him up. They figured Santa would never stay at the North Pole when he could move to a real wasteland. I looked at the return addresses. Most of them were from the United States, but I spotted some eye-catchers too. Farleywick, England, and Hamamatsu, Japan, and Canberra, Canberra. That got me wondering who paid the reply postage. I never found that out. What do you write? I said. Whatever we want. We ain't paid and we aren't the federal government. Ernie had a letter from a little boy last week calling his sister a bitch. Ernie wrote back, said it must run in the family. I got one here from a girl who says, Santa, always please wear your slippers and drink lots of orange juice. So what are you writing? Santa will if you will, said Maud. The door swung open and Ernie yelled, I need baling wire. Maud extricated herself from the booth, but left her letters in the canvas bag. Take one, she said. Take one, she said. Write a reply if you want. I folded my map. I preferred to do square roots at home with a beer anyway. I selected one pale blue envelope with a return address in Seminole, Texas. I didn't open it immediately, though. I watched an 18-wheeler roll to a halt outside. It had artwork on the cab door that contrived to combine the Confederate flag, the Grim Reaper, and Lady Luck, just about free of her leather bikini. The man who got out was shirtless in shorts and sandals. I couldn't have said which was more noticeable, his tattoos, all akin to the illustration on the door, or the billows of sweaty flesh around him that were trying desperately but unsuccessfully to drip down below his hips. That said, in a red suit and beard, he could have done the town proud. Maud checked him at the door. No shirt, no service, she said. Hell, Maud, nice to see you too. No shirt, no service, she repeated. As an afterthought, she added, Bob. Bob went back to the rig to fetch a shirt, and Maud brought me a ham sandwich and 2 jelly donuts. I panicked. I can't pay, I said. I can't sell it, she said. Bread's old, ham's past the date on the package, and I'm not sure about the donuts. Shouldn't hurt you, though. That sandwich was delicious. I read my letter while I ate. It was from Peter, who asked if Rudolph really fired lasers from his nose to protect the North Pole. Bob's shirt was a hideous Hawaiian thing, and he was talking to me before I finished the second donut. Maud got you working, huh? Yeah, I said. Well, Ernie is fixing my truck. That your truck? I don't know what Ernie was doing or why, but outside the gypsy moth was spewing black exhaust. She had never done that before. That's real pretty, said Bob. I like that mermaid. I managed to say thanks. Thing is, he said, frowning, I thought the gypsy moth was a kind of pest. Eats all the trees and stuff. I never thought of that, I said. I think my girlfriend just liked the name. Okay, he said. Uh-huh. Now that I can understand. He looked around the room. Where's she at? Afraid she moved on. Well, I'm sorry to hear that. Let me lighten your load a little bit. He took a handful of letters from the mailbag and shuffled off to a booth across the room. Maud had a coffee on the table before he sat down, and he hadn't had to ask. I wrote back to Peter. I told him to keep quiet because little boys who provoke Rudy get zapped. I hope his mom made him look up provoke. I was going to try my hand at another, but I got distracted. Outside, Ernie had opened up the back and climbed in where the mattress was. There was nothing functional back there, and I couldn't see why he would do that. Moreover, I had certain personal things back there I'd rather he didn't go through. My wallet, for example. In particular, I had 3 pictures and 1 painting of Lola that I didn't want him to see. She had participated in a Bloomington exhibition of women photographing, painting, and sculpting other women. Men were barred from this exhibition, but afterward Lola had given certain artistic shots of herself to me. I didn't think Ernie would understand the context, and I hated the thought of him perving out on the woman I loved. But since he was already back there, I couldn't do anything except hope that he kept his eyes on the job in hand. A motorcycle cop pulled in. He had a handlebar mustache and aviator sunglasses, the kind of cop who thinks he's a film star. I hoped I hadn't eaten his donut. Afternoon, Maud, he said, then stopped at my table. Afternoon, he said. Mind if I take a few of these letters? I slid the bag his way, and he grabbed 4 or 5 envelopes, then went wordlessly to another booth. I guessed Maud would provide pen and paper. I thought about some of the hippies and jazz poets and film studies faculty I encountered sometimes in university towns, people who deplored this other Indiana outside their own incestuous enclaves, and they didn't know the first thing about it. I wanted to stand Lola's new man with his self-indulgent potter's wheel next to Bob and watch him wilt. Bob promised bicycles for Christmas on his lunch hour. Ernie was pure hot sauce and Maud was sheer gravy. Bob's truck had Georgia plates. Crackling CB radios in every semi-truck for 200 miles must swap stories of good times at Maud's and the charming letters to Santa they had read. Highway patrolmen put in for waiting lists to work this patch of turf. All the lonely retrograde denizens and misfits of the great American highway converged here every winter to play an unlikely but heroic role in the lives of millions of children. I half expected to see ZZ Top roll up in the Eliminator. Their famous red beards dyed Santa white. "This is extraordinary," I said when Maud came to refill my coffee. "Just great. Do you get the Hells Angels in here sometimes, all writing letters?" I don't know about the Hells Angels, but we get motorcycle clubs sometimes." "That's not what I meant," I said. I should have stopped, but I liked Maud, and I felt that she liked me, yet I had spent too much time in university towns, and I stepped over the mark. "I mean, do you get big hairy men, ex-convicts from Tennessee? Do you get the hellraisers and beer drinkers and long-hair metalheads and good old boys playing Lynyrd Skynyrd on the jukebox while they're writing those letters from Santa?" "What are you getting at?" said Maud. "I just love it," I said. "You could get the local Grand Dragon in here writing letters to black kids." Maud gave me a level glare. "We don't ask," she said. "We welcome anyone who comes through that door." I didn't get any more coffee the rest of the afternoon. For a couple months after that day, the gypsy moth was a pleasure to drive. She purred when she idled, and she took every rut, rock, and country road I threw at her with an eagerness I never knew she had. "I won't explain what I'd done," said Ernie. "You probably wouldn't understand it anyway." That was a fair point. It was his other next and last comment as I sat at the wheel and prepared to drive away that felt like retaliation for my comments and questions to Maud. "Nice pictures you got back there," he observed. "You ought to send them in to readers' wives."
Thank you, Brian. I think after listening to that story and certainly having read the entire collection, I'm not sure, do I want to go to Indiana right away, or do I never want to go there in my whole life? I don't know. I think, Brian, the thing that strikes you immediately about that is the honesty of the writing, and I suppose the honesty with which all these characters have been created. And I know it's semi-autobiographical is how you describe it. Just how autobiographical is it? You know, did all these things really happen, or is this sort of...
Well, actually, Santa Claus, Indiana exists, but it's a gated community full of wealthy Republicans now. The truck stop I had in mind also exists. Well, it used to, but it's now defunct, but it's nowhere near Santa Claus. So there are germs of truth in everything, but a lot of the details and incidents of the book are either borrowed from someone else's life or made up. The emotional arc of having a really tortured relationship with the state of Indiana is mine.
Is the danger not, though, that everybody back in Indiana will look at this and think, "Oh, you're writing about me," or you're writing with this? How did it go down in Indiana?
Well, my hometown of Evansville was recently ranked number 8 on the list of America's 10 most miserable cities. And when I went there and I did a reading, I thought that it might turn into a book burning rather than a signing. But because they all live there, they know that I'm not really making things up. So I've had a pretty good reaction from southern Indiana, actually.
Is it easier for you, Alison, in a way, because Brian's been so upfront about it and has said this is semi-autobiographical, and obviously your stories, they're fiction, but do you find that there's always maybe that germ of truth that starts them off? How does it work for you?
There are plenty of real events in there. Not all of them are mine exactly. There's in the title story, The Pre-War House, there's a bomb that falls right at the end of someone's garden, and that is a bomb that fell at the end of the house, end of the garden of the house that my dad grew up in Sheffield. So I took that and used that. And there's that sort of thing scattered throughout, with things woven together and some made-up bits, almost stitching them together sometimes.
Or even tiny things like there's a staircase, a rickety staircase up the side of a building that features in one of the stories. That there's the winking that features, and I noticed in the start you sort of thank everybody for the little contributions that they've made. And I think, is it human nature then that people read this and they see themselves in it, or is that the nature of a good story that people can identify with it?
I very much feel that the people, the characters, are made up. I certainly am not conscious of taking real people and putting them into my stories. I wouldn't want to do that. But the people have certainly given me things that I can use. And yes, the staircase you mentioned, this was it's in the first story in the collection. When the door closed, it was dark. And it comes from, in the story, it's an Eastern European country, but it comes from a holiday I went on in the Lake District with my husband and my new baby, who was 8 months old. And the flat we were staying in it could only be accessed by a zigzag metal staircase going up the outside. And it was raining, so I was carrying my baby up these slippery metal steps, and that went straight into the story.
There's one of the things I think both collections have in common is the real sense of place about them. Yours obviously is in a much wider area, the southern Indiana, but your space, Alison, in your collection, it's much smaller. It's really it's a house. It's inside a house, or it's inside a shop. It's much more confined. And I wondered what each of you thought about that sort of sense of place and how central it is to your works. Even Brian, if you want to go first.
The sort of claustrophobia in the pre-war house stories comes from population density, partly. It's a really crowded island over here, and if you were in your sprawling ranch house in Indiana with a big garden on either side of you, you wouldn't have the same sense. So in a way, it's the place determines what we both write, the place we live in.
I think one odd thing I'm aware of in my stories is that when I'm writing, when the story is contained within the home is often the dangerous place. Often in a very small way, it's there are just little fractures in what was or would be an ordinary life. But some of the stories take place away from the home, and in them, the home becomes the safe place which you have left. So the home is very important, but it doesn't always take place within one's home, as in childhood home. But on the other hand, the characters are maybe going to another home where some danger lies. So yes, they generally take place inside houses, and I think there is this physical claustrophobia. And my agent pointed out that after he'd read a few of my stories, he thought I had a fear of being trapped, which is probably true.
Because some of the settings in the short stories, I mean, you can almost feel the walls closing in, and the way that they're drawn, the pre-war house, obviously, which is almost like a character in itself, and it's outlived all of the characters, I think, in that story, or the story with the sweet shop, and the sweet shop feels very sort of contained and claustrophobic. There's a real sense of which life is fractured, isn't it? That the house isn't the place of safety. It's a place where a parent's missing, or a parent has been lost, or something terrible happened in the past, and the house is sort of the focus of this.
I think yes. What I do like is when the world is almost normal and almost comforting, but something's not quite right, and it just shifts the whole balance. And I do like if you can manage to do that with something small. The story I just read out isn't really that sort. That is a much darker story where it's all just turned upside down. But a lot of my stories is just something skewing it slightly.
Yeah. And Brian, there's that sense in your stories as well, because Nationwide, the one that you read, is a very funny story, really, but there are some in the collection that there's a much darker undertone. I'm thinking of the one where Nathan is being tracked by the Klansmen, and the Ku Klux Klan feature in this quite a bit. And again, it's that sense sort of something being fractured, and a real sense of danger. I mean, the incident with the tracking and the Klansmen is very, very, very menacing.
Well, Indiana does have a history of white supremacists, and I would be happier writing about dropping eggs in the radiator all day, but that wouldn't really represent Indiana. So I did throw in some history that, is darker than what I just read.
Did you feel that you had to put in that side of it, or it wouldn't have been representative of the state?
Yeah, and you heard enough to know that the narrator, Nathan, has nothing kind to say about Indiana at all, but he does love it, and in spite of all its flaws, and so I wanted to document its flaws exhaustively.
And that's, I suppose, is very much the nature of things. I mean, we're talking about places that we call home, and people often have that great attachment to them, even though they do have those sort of more negative sides. And even in your stories, Alison, the characters, they do feel very attracted to that setting, don't they? It's part of, I mean, the pre-war house is, even though in itself it feels almost as a malevolent presence at time, the characters are drawn to it, aren't they? It's part of them, and I suppose in both collections, the past is part of everybody. Is that right?
Yes, it is a huge part of you, and it's a formative place, and you might have a very happy childhood, but you nonetheless, a lot of people develop this relationship, get to the point where they need to leave it, and it can be a difficult place to come back to, even if it wasn't unhappy in childhood. I can think of one story, The Smell of the Slaughterhouse, where the protagonist is coming back to a safe place. This is her safe place, actually. She's leaving a dangerous place for a safe place. But even then, yes, it's all on this spectrum of where you're safe.
What do you think, Brian, in terms of that? I mean, is it, I suppose, that the past is always with the character, and then the pull of home and the pull of place is always with them?
Well, I was going to ask Alison, actually. I mean, in your work, the home used to be safe most of the time. Is that fair to say? Or it should be safe. It just isn't. But the idea of safety is at the bottom of the idea of home. In my book, the idea of boredom is at the bottom of the idea of home, so it's not quite the same. But it's worth mentioning, I'm flying back to Indiana indefinitely on Tuesday. I'm not sure I'm qualified to talk about places we call home, because I've lived in Britain for 10 years now, and I'm quite torn between the two. But to get back on topic a little bit, I think people who don't have mixed feelings about home, whether home is construed as a building or a landscape, aren't paying much attention. And there are always problems with that idea that you'll ever be safe, that everything will be hunky-dory. And your anxieties around home represent uncertainty about the future.
Yes, and home has all sorts of associations, and if you're not safe at home, where can you be safe? And I think some of the stories are about making peace with the past, making peace with a difficult. In the title story, The Pre-War House, it's about a grown woman now coming back to her childhood home, where it did all go wrong, get very messy in her childhood, and now she's coming back as a grown woman and trying to make peace with this place and with her past.
One of the other things I wanted to ask you about, Alison, was about the characters, because there's an immense range of different voices in the pre-war house, and some of them quite young children, sort of all the way up to adults, some elderly people. And I was interested to hear how you managed to achieve the authenticity of those voices. I mean, one of my favourite stories, Humming and Pinging, it's a young girl, and it's about things that she doesn't quite understand in the adult world. And I was wondering how you get yourself into that mindset of writing from her point of view so authentically.
Humming and Pinging is actually the earliest of the stories in this collection. I was in my 20s when I wrote it, but of all these stories, I was closest to my childhood, and I'd not done a lot of these fully fledged short stories by that point, so I was probably still writing out my earlier self. And if I think about it now, I don't have a lot of child protagonists, so that's partly where, probably partly explains that. And I possibly have phases as well at the moment. I do seem to be thinking of what I'm writing at the moment. I'm enjoying exploring older people, which is it's a bit of what's the word? It's a bit presumptuous of me because I've not been there yet, but it just feels like this is who this person is, and if I made him something else, I'd just be shoehorning into a body that isn't his. So there's some extent of just trusting in him and going with it
and following him. Exactly. Whereas Brian, people again must assume that you are Nathan, and it was just simply a matter of just writing down what happened or writing down your thoughts. And I imagine, of course, it wasn't that easy.
As far as I know, Maud and Ernie aren't real, based on real people, but I sometimes discover that I've done that and I didn't know it. Anyway, so I never actually had that encounter, but I was over here in England and I thought about that old truck stop, and I wondered, what the people who ran it were like. I was sure that they were big Sarah Palin fans. I was very fond of them for it, but if I actually lived there, they would drive me crazy, and that was the germ of the story. It's impossible to sort of live in the same place with all these competing factions, and that's how America apparently feels now. It's so much polarization. The book as related and the story that I just told, they didn't quite happen to me, but emotionally they did.
Did you ever think of making it a novel? Because when you read the whole collection, and they have the same main characters and they have that narrative arc, did you ever think about making it just a novel as it is?
That would have been a lot of work. As I wrote, and I thought of it as a story collection, the stories began talking to each other about things like race and class and privilege and history in ways that I hadn't really intended, but I felt that they were having a conversation that I should listen to and moderate. So I don't want to say the book wrote itself, but Indiana wrote the book through me in many, many ways. The more I considered Southern Indiana, the more I thought it was actually pretty interesting and pretty underexplored by anybody writing fiction.
And this is something sort of you agreed with, and we were talking earlier about the way that because your stories were written for lots of different purposes, for competitions. They weren't written as a collection, but then when you put them together, you realise that actually they had an awful lot in common.
The biggest shock in putting them together, because these stories are collected from over 13 years, and I wrote them to submit to a magazine and to a competition. Some of them just sprang from me, and some were a response to an invitation to write for something. And it was only when I put them all together that I realised how often the mother leaves or is gone for one reason or another. And sometimes, as in The Smell of the Slaughterhouse, which I mentioned, she's not there, but for no reason pertinent to the story. She just isn't there. She's not part of the story. I was asked about this recently, actually, and I all the stories in here I wrote after, and the earliest of them not long after my mum died, and I think that must be why. I think that the mothers they just go for one reason or another, and I think it's possibly just, I mean, even though some of the reasons are entirely fictionalized, the only one that's actually anywhere close to reality is Helicopter Jean. I think I can only think that this is why she keeps going, or just isn't there. But it was a shock to see them all together and realise that. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. I think we can open it up to questions now. We should have a roving mic. If you just want to raise your hand if you have a question, that there's one at the front here. Just this gentleman here.
I've got a question about point of view. Alison, you used the second person there, which is quite unusual. I mean, how do you decide on point of view? Is that something you just put in straight away, or do you kind of experiment, or how does that work in a kind of process sense?
With that story, that's the only time I've used the second person, and I used it very deliberately in that case because, of course, there should be a point during the story when you realise it's not just this neutral, general you. It is somebody speaking to who is effectively the protagonist. Generally, I have sometimes started started with first person, changed to the third person, and it can help me see the story and see what's not working with it. I think I probably mostly write in the third person, and I think I probably quite like that distance. Even though there are elements of autobiography, I think I can see the story more clearly in that way.
Great. It's lady here at the front.
I wanted to ask Brian, you said you're leaving the UK to go back to Indiana indefinitely, and you described it as going home, but in a way you're also leaving home if you've been here for 10 years, and I wonder what your perspective on the home that you've had in the UK is compared to the home that you grew up in.
My big fear is that I'll get to Indiana and I won't be able to write about anything but England. But living here enabled me to write Snapper in many ways because I could view Indiana with the kind of detachment that I wouldn't have if I were on the ground. But a big part of the reason I'm going back is that I'm working on a second book set in Indiana, and I haven't lived there for 17 years now, so it's very important to go back and refresh my memory. And I said indefinitely because I don't think it's permanent. I will come back here. I love it here, but I have strangely established this relationship with my home state now that I have to follow through.
Anybody else?
Are there any other questions before I ask one? Oh, okay. There is one over there.
Alison, I've got a question about the Lighthouse. You write the main protagonist as this hopeless, hapless person. How easy or difficult was it, or how difficult was it to write a story about a person that one actually never feels any empathy for?
It's a tricky one because I do, and so it's a bit like when he's seen this way, it's like being told that you or someone you love is found wanting, and I realise he is incapable of managing in this world, but the way I feel about him is he's full of hope, and he's trying to move on. So when he goes on this trip, he's really trying to do something and be active. I think the difficulty is that one thing he's trying to do is be Kenny, so he can't ever really inhabit the world fully, but he is trying, and I think he's just, it's kind of sewn into him that he never will manage, which is obviously awful of me to make him that way. But it's just, it's necessary for the story. But I do feel very much for him. But no, I have to say it's not that a reader should. I think